find it really fascinating that most of these mystical assertions are now done without God. Like
Right.
there doesn't need to be anything resembling any kind of theistic assertions. Where I think other forms of mysticism, I mean, even kind of like Buddhist forms of mysticism, where there's not like a strong kind of metaphysical theism, there still is some sense of kind of organized religion, in
Mhm.
some kind of great ultimate or something. And in what I saw here were deep spiritualities, but without any real need for them to have God within them. And so that's kind of where I'm going with secular mysticisms.
Yeah, so it's secular, and this is where Taylor's kind of nuanced understanding of that term is really helpful or maddening, I guess, depending on how comfortable you are with complications. But it's secular in the sense of no referent to a transcendent. It's not secular in the sense of, which is kind of the popular sense of secular, is just no belief.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah, that seems to be the distinction there.
Yeah, or that like transcendence becomes completely it becomes completely outside like symbols and systems and
Right.
uh like it becomes somewhat there still might be a transcendent quality which I try to I think there's a certain way that even Taylor's perspective on transcendence there's slippage in it that
Mm,
I try to, I mean, who am I to say this, but kind of
right.
clean up a little bit here.
Hmm.
Uh, but like the transcendent referent is not outside of you.
Right.
For a lot of people now, it's within you or
Hmm.
in within the sphere of your own action within the world is where it is. And so that has a kind of transcendence to it that we call spirituality, and even a kind of mystical overtones.
Yeah.
But its real goal is not to commune, say, with the divine being as kind of classic forms of mysticism is. I
Right.
think it's maybe we're jumping ahead here, but it's
It's
really
okay.
to with yourself and to find your truest self, is what becomes the kind of mobilizing. And it's fascinating to live in an age where you kind of need spiritualities and you need mysticisms, not to find some mystery, not to find some divine being, but to find yourself.
Hmm.
That's kind of fascinating to me.
Yeah, a spiritual quest in the imminent frame, I guess, you could say. Um, you talk about this in the book. I actually really liked. It felt to me, I don't know if I am judging this correctly, but it felt to me like there was a lot more personal reflection threaded through this. Like you were almost incorporating some of the memoir elements into a book on memoirs, which was fun. And I know you talk about this in the book, but do you want to say anything more about how did you stumble upon memoir as the genre to explore next? Like you talk about begrudgingly kind of opening one up, but yeah, do you want to comment any more on how that looked for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's important because I'm not,
Right.
I'm sitting in a room filled with books. I read for a living, but I read like academic
Right.
theology and philosophy books. I don't read for fun. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Before we started recording, or maybe you recorded this and this will be on our conversation or not. Like I'm a TV watcher. Like that's how I
right.
relax. Like my wife, Cara, reads, about 5 books a week, like novels and memoirs that
Oh
she's
wow.
just before she goes to bed, she's reading all the time. And I don't do that. I kind of turn my brain off and watch TV. So it is a little odd for me to start reading a bunch of memoirs because I'm not like super into memoirs or anything
Right.
like that. But I've been given these memoirs over the years,
Mm.
and I am the weird kind of person that if I have a book in my library, I need to read it.
Yeah,
Like
yes, yeah, I know that. I know
you
that
know what I
feeling.
mean? I mean, I have stacks of books that I'm getting to, but the idea is that I'm going to read these. I'm not going to keep a book in my library that I have no intention to ever read. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like I just can't live with 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 the burden of that. The beckoning call to read it.
Yes.
So like people gave me, well, particularly I was gifted, educated,
Mhm.
by Westover, and I kind of resisted it, and then when I go on vacation, I try to grab some like just books I wouldn't regularly read. I mean, I usually kind of like read these really big, like historical biographies by Beethoven or
Oh yeah, yeah.
Napoleon or something because I'm a complete idiot. But this was in my pile. I was like, all right, I got to get through this because I have this, and I was really moved by it. But I was particularly moved by her story of uh, of transformation. I mean, there's a clear, and I guess this is just
Yeah.
how narrative in some sense works. Is you're kind of giving a flow, and it was just really clear that this was a story of transformation. This was a story of being changed in the deepest way, and yet what changed her was like education. It wasn't God, but it was such a radical transformation, and people can read it. I mean, she's like a kid who's never been to school, and then she ends up, at Cambridge and
It's
at
an amazing
Harvard.
story.
It
Yeah.
is an amazing story, and it's amazingly written.
Hmm.
But there is a kind of well, there's a horizon of what really changes, and
Mm.
what really changes a human being, and she thinks education changes it, which has, been a common way we think about it. But she comes from a community where, in a very fundamentalist way, like believing in the Bible and believing in a God who's bringing an apocalypse is supposed to be really clear. But she kind of, in some sense, she's very respectful, but kind of outgrows that and finds a very different kind of engine that transforms her. And so that was fascinating to me. And I did write it. I mean, I don't know. I have not received an email or a call from Airbnb, but I feel like, there should be some sponsorship dollars in
Yeah,
that.
you definitely plugged in Airbnb a lot.
Like
That's true.
Airbnb quite a bit. So each chapter kind of starts with, I guess it's kind of memoir like, which is, saying something for someone who doesn't read many memoirs, to try
Mm.
to have these memoir elements in them. Yeah, so you're kind of, our travel experiences as a family are kind of set the terms for each chapter, or yeah, they lead into that. So there
Yeah.
is a sense where there is a lot more personal stuff in that way. I also feel like in a bit this book is probably lacking some hooks that are in the other book, particularly more direct hooks around kind of pastoral practice and kind of church
Mm.
life, like I think I'm asking the reader to do a little bit more creative work and thinking about, like, how does this really, how do you hang these ideas
Yeah.
within day-to-day ministry life? I feel like that, to review and critique myself on here is something that could have been a little bit highlighted. I mean, there's moments where
Yep.
I think we really touch on it, but maybe not as much as the other books, where it feels like all of a sudden I'm taking you into someone else's practice, direct pastoral practice, and that
Right.
doesn't happen as much. I take you more into my Airbnbs,
Yeah.
for good or for ill. Yeah.
Well, there's a sense that my that resonates with me. I can see what you're saying. There's a sense that the topics you're wrestling with here are so, I don't know if I want to say more esoteric or something than the rest of the book, but I mean the previous book was a lot of economics, so it was
Yeah.
very felt very different in a practical sense. But yeah, there's a lot of just reflecting on the nature of the self, and what do we even mean by the self, and what are the assumptions that are bundled into that in our time, and then the transformation of the self is not really much more practical. um, but so I'm fascinated by the fact that and I want to get to the triangle in a minute. I want to spend some
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
on that because I love that. I love the triangle. But I'm just really fascinated by the fact that you picked up Tara Westover's book not intending to engage in a research project. You just read it because it was at hand, and then it almost feels as though you stumbled into this kind of vein of a genre of writing that kind of encapsulates how we think about personal transformation, spiritual transformation in our immanentized, secular time. I just think that's really interesting. Do you remember off the top of your head what the second memoir you picked up was after that? That might be a little bit too of a
Well,
obscure
I was
question.
I was also given as a gift when Breath Turns to Air.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I can't pronounce his last name. I don't have it at hand.
Kalanithi, I think, something like that.
I think that's right. And I also was resistant to read. It's like, I should read some, philosophy book or something
Mm.
like that. But I remember reading it one summer at home on my porch, and then like just breaking down and
Oof.
crying and crying and crying, because it was just so beautiful how
Yep.
it. So yeah, I mean, that one I think I even read before Westover, so I think it kind of primed me that
I see.
there might be something here.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that was it. And then what I did, when I had this sense, I mean, this was, and part of this was born too, is, this is just a lot of my life, is that I was in a meeting, and I mentioned this in the preface, and we were trying to just talk about, well, how do we think about evangelism? How do we think
Right.
about kind of transformation? How do we think about discipleship making? And I was just really interested in how these different kind of forms of transformation, kind of from picking up from Westover, like, gosh, she's really making certain claims on what changes a human being,
Mm.
like and maybe not universally, but gosh, going through this process of education was a dynamic transformation for her. And I think the book is loved because people believe that. People believe that education can really, really change you. And I just thought there's got to be other pathways to this, and it would be fascinating to look at them. And so I like raised this in this little kind of reflection research group at my institution, and everyone kind of gave me a look like, what the heck are you talking about? And I'm sure I articulated it very poorly, but I think I feel my most comfortable in this little monastic cell I'm in right
Yeah.
now. It was just like onto Amazon and, buy a bunch of books.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there was no real systematic reason why I chose the memoirs I chose, other than I like just looked at lists from the
Hmm.
last 5 to 8 years on like top top 50 memoirs, top 10 memoirs, and just kind of pulled those and then started reading them. And there were some that just didn't work,
Sure.
I think I end up mentioning maybe 11 or 12 throughout the book, that become kind of formative, maybe a little more than that, maybe about 20. But they come into these different kind of lanes that we'll get to when we get to the triangle. But yeah, there were some that were just garbage, like in
Yeah.
that garbage in the sense of just terrible to read. And there was no real point here, and
Yeah.
complete vanity exercise.
Yeah.
But then there were a lot of these that really made certain claims on what it means to live well and what it means to be transformed. And yeah, so
Wow. Well, yeah, let's get to the triangle. I do want to ask you, this didn't occur to me just now, but did you read any in this research process, did you read any explicitly Christian memoirs, or did you mostly stick with you did? Oh, interesting. I haven't thought about, we don't need to open that up necessarily, but maybe off the air. Uh
okay, yeah.
I haven't thought about this, but it would be interesting to map explicitly faith-based memoirs on the triangle. That would be fascinating. But let's okay, we keep talking about the triangle.
Yeah.
Let's actually get to the triangle. I'm
It
gonna
would be interesting because I think you could. I read a couple,
yeah,
and they weren't great, and
yeah.
so we won't mention any. But they
Sure.
kind of, as we get to this triangle, they kind of slid down the triangle, like
Sure.
they're
That's my instinct actually.
yeah.
That doesn't
Yeah.
surprise me.
Oh
Um,
wow, we
we
even
have a
have
visual.
way, yeah.
Yeah, I was mocking this up on the Zoom whiteboard before you logged on. So, um, I want to talk through this. I thought it'd be helpful to just have it in front so
Yeah, absolutely.
people could see what the terms we're referring to. Um, and yeah, so let's talk about the three corners. I pick Why don't you pick a corner and start with whichever one you want, and we'll just give a brief definition of it and how
Okay.
you came to it.
Well, first of all, I mean, we should just make people aware that I was a recovering diagramaholic, and so I really try to get away from diagrams in my writing. Anyone who's read some of my earlier stuff, and
Yeah.
particularly like earlier articles right out of PhD program, I was in love with diagrams.
Yeah.
And then I started to read other people's pieces with diagrams in them, and like this makes no sense to me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this
That's what
probably
I'm doing to people.
so then I weaned myself off diagrams, and in this project, I've just completely fallen off the wagon. So on diagrams, but I guess I think it's kind of helpful. So I mean, this does go back to kind of Charles Taylor's part 5 of the secular age, so there's a kind of certain way that it's taken 6 volumes to kind of pick out all these pieces from his big tome of a book. And so his basic point that I've always found really fascinating since I read it is that he wants us to realize that the conflicts and dilemmas that confront us in modernity they're never kind of polar opposites. It's never just two kind of conflicting
Mm,
sides. So we talk about this kind of culturally all the time, that we live in such polarized times, that there's two groups always against each other. And Taylor thinks that that's not quite right, that we
yeah.
are in a really conflicted time, but usually our conflicts are triangulated, where there are two
Hmm.
sides who actually don't agree with each other much and don't like each other, but they can team up on
Mm,
another side, in that we're always kind of switching back and forth. So this will make for very strange bedfellows depending on what
yeah.
other issues. So I mean, in some sense, like as I talk, I'm starting to talk more and more to groups about this. And one of the things you realize is if you throw a different issue in the center of the triangle, all of a sudden
All the alignments change.
all the
Yeah.
alignments start changing
Yeah.
as you deal with them. But he wants to kind of, his point is, if you look at people who have a hard time with religion, you'll notice that it's not it's not one group against religion. That there are two sides that are against this. So
Hmm.
one of the ways he articulates this is a very common one, and I think a very significant one in our cultural moment, is that you have this side of people who are uncomfortable with religion that he calls the exclusive humanists, that they simply think that religion is repressive. It tells people how to live their lives. It tells you that your desires may not be good. At least some of your desires aren't good. It really violates what Taylor calls the modern moral order, which is this
Hmm.
kind of sense that people have to have the freedom to live out of their own experience, to live out of their own kind of deepest sense of their self. But he also wants to say, so you can see that there's this argument of repression here, and so religion will respond to it and say, well, no. Okay, I no, it's all religion's really all about love and God's complete acceptance, and it's all about welcome, and God welcomes everyone, and God just embraces everything within us, whether it's dark or light. God loves us completely. Well, once you make that statement, all of a sudden the other side appears.
Mm.
Counter enlightenment people are like, this is the problem with religion, is it's just this fairy tale. I mean,
Right.
talk about a make believe situation, and this is the problem with religion, is it polarizes the darker parts of reality. It edits out kind of human will and fighting, and this
Hmm.
sense that there's death and destruction. I mean, sometimes it's not quite framed that way, but there is a sense where if the exclusive humanists really are about the modern moral order, then the encounter enlightenment really are about the will to power.
Yeah.
uh, and they tend to think like religion is a problem because it can't face really the depth of human experience. But then religion responds, it's like, no, see, we believe the world is sinful, we believe evil is real, we believe
Right.
is acting to conquer evil and bring forth God's kingdom. And then as soon as we say that, we're like, you know the church is God's gym, or something crazy like that. Then
Right.
the other side responds and is like, "Oh, see, there it is. You're
Yeah.
really repressive, and you feel caught between these two poles, or as Taylor says, you impale yourself on one horn of
Hmm.
critique, or you impale yourself on the other horn of critique." But it ultimately shows that there's more at play here, and that perspective always I found interesting.
So
and
helpful.
and then I thought, okay, like what would happen if we started to use that as a map, like that
Hmm.
triangulation? And can we start to kind of see different people, and can we start to see these paths of transformation inside of that kind of map? So what Taylor says is both sides are uncomfortable with religion's commitment to something beyond, and that's
Yeah.
why I call them the beyonders. That's my word, the beyonders. But he says they're uncomfortable with something beyond. The exclusive humanists are uncomfortable that religion says there's something beyond just human flourishing.
Right.
Religion wants human flourishing, but it also thinks that there's a deeper something. There's something to reach for that's just beyond having a society that allows individuals to be themselves or to be happy or something. But the encounter enlightenment perspective is just ultimately uncomfortable with the religion's sense that there's something beyond death. Like it,
Right.
um, they just feel like, "Oh, that's just you're just pacifying and giving yourself a way to opt out of kind of willfully taking action in this life."
Hmm.
And so that sense of the religion's commitment that there's something beyond in those two ways, sense to me defines what a beyonder is. And a big question that I hope people wrestle with in the book is how much Protestantism and American Protestantism has felt uncomfortable, has been
Hmm.
made to feel uncomfortable with those two commitments, and therefore depending on disposition, really mainline evangelical, has tried to find cover by making friends with either the encounter enlightenment or the exclusive humanists, and it's somehow, and in some ways, kind of a la Esau, has given up its birthright as being a beyonder. and
Wow.
and kind of my biggest push here is like, can Protestantism reimagine itself as people who are committed to the beyond? And I don't mean that just as a purely metaphysic, like
Right.
in kind of a transcendental way. I mean it as living our lives in a way and having an ethic that we think there's something beyond just exclusive humanism, and something beyond just the will to power. And
Yeah.
yet I think the modern moral order and the will to power has kind of colonized both forms of Protestantism in America in different ways. And you can start to see why actually evangelical Protestants or mainline Protestants hate each other more than they hate anything else. Because all of a
Yeah,
sudden they're down the triangle and they're
that's right.
more unalike than, say, even 20, 30 years ago or 50 years ago when things weren't so politicized and it wasn't a culture war and they were
Right.
closer up. And then, yeah, maybe I don't understand why Presbyterians are like this. I don't understand why, Episcopalians do this stuff, but yeah, they're kind of like us. You know what
They
I
were
mean? Like
closer
that.
together. Yeah, the
Yeah.
distance was shorter. Yeah.
Yeah. The distance between them was shorter.
Yeah, man, I love it. I love it. Well, at least for this pastor in New England, this diagram was extraordinarily helpful. So, and I also love, for me, the gravity image of like the pressure to slide down the triangle was really helpful. And the strange bedfellows you're talking about are like the like in our culture war throws, there's a lot of very conservative Christians who have allied with very staunch atheists who are all against, whatever quote unquote wokeness means to
Yeah.
them. That's just a great example of sliding on the triangle and finding yourself more in alliance with someone
Yeah.
that you wouldn't have expected in another age or
Yeah.
another time.
Mega church pastors who are teamed up with red pill internet
Yeah.
people. You know what I mean? Like the people who just want to destroy everything. And also mega church pastors are like, yeah, I like that guy. Like, yeah, there's a certain ways that makes for really strange bedfellows that
hmm
would not have been here at other times.
and seeing the common enemy, I guess I don't love that verbiage, but yeah, seeing the common thing they're reacting against, but then the different ways those reactions take. I think that's what really started to help me kind of flesh out what you
Yeah.
were getting at. Can we map a couple? I mean, you
Yeah.
mentioned Tara Westover is educated. Can we map just a few memoirs maybe to help the
Yeah.
the person watching this kind of continue to wrap their minds around this? Where would you plot educated as? Because again, sorry, let me summarize a little bit more too, if I can. You're proposing that these paths of transformation in our secular age tend
Yeah.
to map onto this triangle closer or farther away from certain corners based on what claims they make about what transformation, the pathway to transformation looks like. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, and maybe one way to think about this that will then help the memoirs make sense. And this is this is the weird age we're in. Like I feel like this is controversial to even say, but you
Mm,
could like if people are open to it, like think of where you would place Donald Trump versus where you would place Hillary Clinton, which
right.
where you would place Joe Biden. And in some sense, like Trump is a kind of counter Enlightenment kind of president, and all the way across on the other side would be like Hillary Clinton. Um, and then Joe Biden is a little bit up closer towards the Beyonders, and you start to understand, like, oh, I can see why more evangelicals, maybe holding their nose, voted for Biden. If you kind of
Mm,
evangelicals, maybe towards the middle of the counter Enlightenment side in some ways, it's a lot less to go, and you also start to see why they feel like, well, I don't like Trump completely, but he feels closer. So
yeah, yeah. So depending on how far you slide up or down this side, you might be closer to a Biden type figure
yeah.
or closer to a Trump type figure. But it has more to do with how you react to the notion of beyond. What is beyond us? Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so anyhow, I mean, and maybe that's just, I don't even know. Like I'm starting to think about presentations of this material and like
yeah.
scared to death to just put these politicians up because people feel. I mean, this is
Right.
part of the sign. Part of the signs of our time is you can feel why people feel so loyal to those
Yeah.
perspectives. You know what I mean? Like that, they're on that team. They feel the gravity pulling them towards that side. And but you can also see like why Trump and Hillary hate each other so much.
hmm
They're so far across the sides. So
Such
when it comes
radically different visions
radically
of
different, right?
yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And therefore radically different kind of moral stances on
Mhm.
what it means to kind of inhabit the world. And you can hear it in the language, like the language of acceptance
Yes.
on one side, like accepting people's different identities, and on the other side, it's like we have to be strong.
Yeah.
Like you'll never take this country back with weakness. Like this is
Right.
like our enemies are all before us. Like you can hear the will to power, and then you can hear the modern moral order there.
Yeah.
And depending what kind of Protestant you are and where you're sliding down, you find one of them repulsive. Like one
That's
of the
what I was
way,
just thinking. Yep.
the way they talk, you find absolutely repulsive.
Man.
And Yeah, and you find the other one, you can stomach it, even if you're not completely comfortable with it,
Right.
like, you can stomach it for different reasons, and that really leads to a huge, huge division here, you know?
It's funny you use the word repulsive because I was thinking of the word disgust before you
Yeah,
said that, and I was thinking of Jonathan Haidt's, work on kind of the moral
yeah,
reasoning and moral taste buds, and he talks about the power of disgust pretty blatantly, and it is helpful, and I think you can do it in a, I know we're using controversial, potentially political figures, but I think you can speak about it in a very descriptive way, as to say like, oh, it makes sense why this pathway would find this really radically different pathway just very disgusting. Like, I think there's a very visceral response there because it's such a
yeah,
different
yeah,
telos, and it's such a different call to
yeah,
how do we respond to our situation that we find ourselves in. It's
yeah.
so different. um
Yeah, I think Height's work is really helpful, that our moral visions are somewhere deep in our gut, in that this becomes a kind of gut reaction. So,
mhm.
yeah, just so people know, it's like I try to complicate this a lot, like pop culture figures,
Yeah, yeah,
philosophers,
yeah.
like folks like that. So, yeah, it's a little bit of like, shooting fish in a barrel just to throw up Trump and Hillary and Biden or something, So, uh,
Well,
I
we've
want
already
people
talked
to
about
just
educated.
just focus there. Yeah.
Yeah, let's not, yeah, let's you know what, let's take him down. Uh um so we already talked about educated. How
Yeah.
would you, as you think about a memoir and a memoir like educated, how would you map it out on this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what happens is that you can map them on these sides. I mean, one thing to say about this, even if folks are going to use it descriptively, is and I think this is really fair to Taylor. You can never live on the point, any of these
Right.
points. So, no matter who you are, no matter what issues before you, there's a certain way that being a late modern person means you're pulled between at least two of these sides.
Mhm.
You'll always be leaning towards one or the other. So there's not a kind of purity dynamic here that says like we could be purely only beyonders. There's
Right.
ways that you're gonna have a little tilt towards a kind of modern moral order, or a little tilt towards the will to power, and you may be able to kind of place yourself over time, but it really will depend on the issue. So Westover would be definitely on the exclusive humanist side. That education becomes a way she finds her truest self.
Mm.
So in some sense, Westover and Brandy Carlisle's memoir, I feel like are two kind of quintessential memoirs of the exclusive humanist side.
Mm.
Really, ultimately, is it kind of I have these different kind of lanes on here that I think kind of inhabit these pathways. And in this pathway of the exclusive humanist, like the ultimate lane here that Westover and Carlyle represent, is you finding your most inner genius. That
Right.
you have a kind of inner artist, inner genius within you, and it's buried by all sorts of things, and it's mainly buried by people who don't see you the way you really are, or people
Right.
that misrepresent you, or people that don't accept you. That it's buried by all those things, but there is a genius within, and if you can unearth it, you can pull it out, and
Hmm.
you can kind of live this magnificent life of this kind of inner genius, this inner artist that's at play. And that's a real primary one, of the modern moral order. All the other ones that are on this side, which I kind of map romance as one, like there's these memoirs of people who fall in love. And
Right.
when they fall in love, they find who they really are. Like love becomes this mystical quality that pulls them into um, kind of being able to take away all the things that block them from being their truest self, and they find them. And another interesting one is parenting, on this modern moral order side. And that's fascinating because there's a certain way that like parenting memoirs in some sense made the market of memoirs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like mommy blogging and things like that came along. And part of that is that you have to bring together this really strange thing, which you have to bring together this moral commitment to transcend conformity, like
Mm.
especially in the modern moral order, you're unique. You have to find your unique self. This you can hear echoes of volume 5 here. You have to find your singularity.
Right.
But then you also are a parent, and in some sense, what your child needs is conventionality. So how are you going to be a conventional parent that's a good parent, but isn't like your mom who drives you crazy,
Yeah.
or you? I mean, it's kind of like those commercials, those progressive commercials or whatever, like, homeowners who become their parents. Is that the right insurance company? Did I have that right?
Oh
Was it?
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
I don't know, whatever. Everyone knows those
yeah.
great commercials. I guess they're not that great if you don't remember the company that's spending millions and millions of dollars, but you remember the commercials.
And
But
not the brand. Yeah,
that becomes the problem of parenting, is that you become your parents, but you don't want to be. You don't want to be your conventional.
right.
You still want to be your unique inner artist, and so you need like this spiritual, mystical guide who shows you how to be both unconventional and conventional. I mean, it's a very hard late modern thing to
Mm,
be a mom or a dad and remain cool. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like, you need a spiritual guide to help you how to balance that.
yeah.
So those are all different kind of pathways on um this exclusive humanist side. But it has this deep sense that you are a kind of magnificent self who is has to overcome certain messages or certain kind of buried talent that if you can find a way to mine, um,
Mm,
not kind of get stuck in stories of shame. I mean, like,
yeah,
this is controversial too, but like Brene Brown really becomes a very helpful person on this side, because part of it is there's a performative dynamic to it. And when you're performing, you're risking, and when you're risking and failing, you feel shame, and so like vulnerability and dealing with kind of senses of failure. I think you feel guilty that you can't perform. You can't perform like others.
right.
That becomes really helpful to folks who are kind of looking for spirituality on this side of the triangle.
Mm,
And so this
wow,
is the
yeah,
other dynamic we said about Taylor too, is that I using some theology. I mean, a way to think about the kind of transcendence here is that it's an internally bound transcendence.
yeah.
So when you find your inner talent and you receive recognition for it, you do feel some kind of spirituality, some kind of transcendence, but it starts and ends with yourself. It's with
Hmm.
you.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's
Yeah,
those are, I think, yeah, the pathways there.
that's really helpful. I mean, of course, thinking about the buffered self, spirituality within the buffered self,
Yeah, yeah.
the inner genius fits there in some ways. There, there's a lot of tensions that come up because of. And I think is Taylor the one who uses the term politics of recognition, like that at some point the inner genius needs to be recognized by the social network fabric that you find yourself in, and so there's tensions there too, but um, which I guess pull between the poles of the Beyonder and the exclusive humanist. But yeah, that's really helpful. Um, yeah, what's a prototypical memoir on the counter enlightenment side, or a figure or something that would help flesh that out?
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful ways to think about this is, so instead of you trying to mine what's within you, your own inner genius, it really becomes more external than internal, but it
Right.
still is in the purview of your own action. So it's
Hmm.
still what you do, but it really is a kind of Nietzschean sense. And not
Yeah.
all of these people would like fundamentally be Nietzscheans, but they write their memoir in a kind of Friedrich Nietzschean kind of way of it. What they really discover is that they can overcome, that they can conquer. And so some of the examples of these are like Reinar Wynn's books. The Salt Path is one of them. And there's all sorts of other memoirs like this, like Strands, that became a movie that was quite popular a few years ago. But
127 hours one, or
no, this is the one with Reese Witherspoon where she
oh right.
walks the Pacific Trail.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I can't
and there's
think of
this
what it's
kind of,
called.
yeah, and so it's the same kind of thing, that one of the ways you can be transformed is if you can face nature and overcome it. Like you get pulled into its beauty of nature, but really it's about you doing something you never thought you could
Right.
do. Like, so the Reiner Wind ones, she's a Welsh woman. She loses everything. Her husband gets diagnosed with a terminal disease. They lose their house in some kind of bad investment gone bad. So they decide to wild camp and walk this like 600-mile trail in southern England,
Mm,
and it saves them. Like legitimately, almost miraculously. Like when her husband is on the trail exerting his like will to walk the 600 miles, his disease goes away. And
wow.
then like when they go in the winter, when they go like find an apartment to rent, his disease comes back. So they got to get back out on the trail. There's this deep sense that like if you can just face nature and overcome it, you can be changed. And she even says really profoundly in the book, like really directly and articulately, like she doesn't believe in God. Like
Mm.
she believes in no God. She believes there's no plan. She thinks we're just carbon, and it's a carbon cycle at play.
Yeah.
But she has a deep sense that you can be transformed if you can overcome constraint, if
Mm.
you can overcome what you thought you could do. And she has these, I mean, they are like mystical kind of miracle senses of healing and finding your inner power you didn't think you had,
Wow.
like, and so it's, you can see it's not internal, it's not
Yeah.
unmining what you do out there. Another example is there's these vocational narratives, which are really about kind of you finding what there's a calling sense to it. You can see the mystical kind of senses of calling, but the calling is like to be the best at something. And
Hmm.
one that I found the most insightful was one by Samuelson called Yes Chef. And it's a memoir about him, how he became like this great chef in New York City. And it's very clear that if you want to be the best, especially in something like you know, the kitchen in New York City, you have to give everything up. You
Yeah.
have to be willing to burn all boats and give your life completely to this. It is very much a kind of Viking tale of you being willing to go and kind of fight for your dream. And there's all these really interesting kind of moral conundrums with it. Like he ends up in the Alps, he starts dating this woman, he gets her pregnant, but then the job becomes available, like the first step into New York City where he wants to be comes, and he just leaves this pregnant girlfriend and doesn't see, I mean, that part of it is like he doesn't have time. It's 24/7,
Right.
every day of the year he's focused on this dream. He doesn't see this girl until she's like in her almost in her teens or something.
Wow.
And there's kind of like no sense of regret. There's like, this is what you have to do.
It's the
This is what
cost.
you have to do
Yeah.
to have it all. You have to burn your boats and go for this. And there's a deep sense of that kind of heroic
Right.
victory of knowing what you're called to be the best of, or what you're called to conquer, and then conquering it. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I thought it'd be fun before we too quickly run out of time, because I do want to obviously talk about the Beyonder
Yeah,
triangle.
yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
probably important to spend some time there before we wrap. This I find these kinds of diagnostics so fascinating. I love, my brain was just kind of whirring as I was reading it, with like mapping this out on different kinds of stories or movies, or even just even narratives of like testimonies and stuff within churches and sermons and all of that stuff. But I thought it'd be fun. I just jotted down, I couldn't remember. I didn't, yeah, I jotted down some names. I wanted to just throw these at you. I want to see what where you'd place them. So,
Okay, we'll see how
uh,
I do. I may
yeah.
completely bomb at this.
I think this would be a fun way to even flesh out some more. So, all right, Taylor Swift. Where would you put Taylor Swift?
Oh
Do you
gosh.
know anything about Taylor Swift?
Well, I think I fear this because I could be murdered very easily. Her fan base. I mean, I think you would have to put Taylor Swift on the exclusive humanist
Yeah.
side. Like, and again, no one purely is one thing.
Yeah.
And if you threw a different issue up, she may all of a sudden flip somewhere else. But I think she would. She most definitely is a kind of an example of someone who has a great talent within her, and she unmined it. She excavated that, and it is an inner genius. Is
Hmm.
model of an inner genius, and kind of creates a kind of crew of people who are fighting for the modern moral order in some way, like yeah, so I definitely put her on the exclusive humanist side. And she gives a lot of advice about how to ignore those who don't see you the
Yes.
right way,
The
like Shakespeare.
haters. Yeah.
The
Hmm.
haters become real, and she wants to help her people kind of move beyond the haters. You can see why the haters are such a problem, because
Hmm.
they keep you from finding and getting affirmation for your most genius self.
Yeah, that makes total sense. All right, one more. I know this one's maybe a little controversial. We won't do any more controversial ones after this. But where'd you put Elon Musk?
Oh, this is a really,
Yeah.
really good one. So I mean, one of the things I do in the book is, part of the critiques of religion is to say, like, well, you could never trust people who believe in the beyond,
Right.
because crusades, bro.
Mhm.
30 years war, like,
Yeah.
look at what happens when people believe something, they do really awful stuff. And part of my perspective is like, well, look at exclusive humanist side, especially in our kind of contemporary moment, and the counter enlightenment side. And both of those kind of forms of belief and
Mhm.
of reaching for transcendence have spun out into some weird stuff. Like,
Mhm.
the location of a lot of our conspiracy theories comes out of a certain counter enlightenment will to power.
That's right. Mhm.
And in some sense, like, even some of our conspiracy theories that kind of go back to more political, the left, come out of exclusive humanism, or what I talk about in the book, these kind of tech bros who think that you could just optimize your way out of every problem.
Right.
You know, like, if we just put it on the blockchain, we can figure out everything. Like,
Yep.
poverty can be taken care of if you just figure out how to optimize and scrape data and then use it in the right way. Like, every human problem has a kind of technical solution to it. Is its own kind of weird, kind of spun out uh, fundamentalism. And so part of my point is there's no doubt crusades and the 30 Years War and things like that were a problem for beyonder commitments that need to be judged. But it's pure propaganda for those who are opposed to a beyonder way to think, like their sides are completely rational and can't spin out. So Elon Musk is a good one because part of my temptation is to put him like with Zuckerberg and Bezos as a spun out exclusive humanist, as a kind of Silicon
Right.
Valley way that if we just create social media spaces where people can truly express themselves and be connected, then we can enter into a utopia of kind of broadly moral liberal values or something, which is completely like
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
But I think Elon Musk is one of those, but I really actually think he's a counter enlightenment guy.
That's what I think too.
I
Yeah.
think I think he would be somewhere on that counter enlightenment side. I think that and I think there are these really rich people. There's an interesting French thinker who writes about climate change, and he says what's happened in this climate moment is that the ultra rich have pretty much decided that we're all screwed, and aren't
Oh,
really all
no.
that interested really in kind of a shared world anymore, but are kind of
Mm.
create ways of like protecting themselves in kind of apocalyptic moments. And I think Elon Musk takes some kind of joy in thinking about institutional structures and things all coming undone.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some sadistic there. Yeah, and I do think, like, there is a sense of, and you can sometimes see this with like even someone like Mark Cuban, who often represents and like will tweet for kind of exclusive humanist perspectives. Sometimes when it comes to like the pure wars of capitalism, will all of a sudden take on certain will to power
Hmm.
enlightenment perspectives. You know what I mean? Like,
Interesting. Yeah.
so it really does depend on what's at stake. But I think sensibility wise, Elon Musk is much more kind of driven by a kind of counter enlightenment will to power.
That's just interesting. Yeah. All right. Just a couple fictional ones now. Where would you put Elsa from Frozen?
Yeah, see, my kids are a little bit too old to have
Uh,
been for Elsa. I mean, I don't. I think there's got to be a sense that she's an exclusive humanist, right? She really definitely believes there's a self under there, right? That
mhm.
you're trying to unfreeze in some way, or something like that. But I
Yeah.
don't feel like I know enough about Elsa to
Okay.
really be an authority on where Elsa would be.
In her path of spiritual transformation. Fair enough.
Yeah,
What about Batman?
that's a good one. Um, I think Batman, in some sense, I guess it depends on which Batman you're talking about, and
Sure.
and
Yeah.
I'm not enough of a noble nerd to be able to do this. But I think at its core, Batman actually is a counter enlightenment person fighting for the kind of weak. There's a certain sense that he has to kind of go beyond. He fights for the little guy, but it's a fight. Like, the little
Hmm.
guy cannot win in this battle of the will to power, and so he becomes um, he becomes the fist of the one who doesn't have it. So I mean, I think one of the issues with this diagram that people have to be really clear on is this isn't, especially in our moment, it isn't a left right perspective.
Correct.
Like,
Right.
right
Right.
right now, we almost all of our more kind of right wing people are counter Enlightenment people, and the left is exclusive humanist. But that has not always been true.
Right.
And in the 80s, particularly, the left were
Hmm.
counter Enlightenment people. Like, you just think like punk and heavy metal were politically leftist, counter Enlightenment kind of perspectives. Or you think of like, like
That's
all
interesting.
the senators' wives who were like against like Ice-T or whatever at
Right.
the end of the 80s, early 90s, they were conservatives who were really about exclusive humanism. I mean, some of us that are older enough, one of the really fascinating things is it used to be the right who policed your language, and now
Right.
it's left who polices your language. But they were both for different reasons functioning out of a modern moral order. So it used to be like the religious right. I don't mean like the religious right, like people on the right who are religious who
Hmm.
were always very concerned with shock jocks saying certain things on the radio, or
Right.
they're using bad words on primetime TV. And now it's flipped, and the people who are worried about what words are used are on the left, but
Hmm.
they're both across time kind of they're supporting modern moral order. And it's just fascinating that
Yeah.
now, now the exclusive humanists, or those who are really committed to the modern moral order, are on the left, where 3 decades ago they were on the right.
Yeah. That's interesting. All right, we'll do one more. One more. I seem to remember you were a Game of Thrones fan.
Yeah.
So I want to know, where would you put Ned Stark?
Okay, so here, this is a very important point, especially if we talk about Beyonders, is that you cannot put Ned Stark on the diagram,
Oh
because
boy. Okay.
Ned Stark is not modern. So
Oh, okay.
this
Wow.
this
Good. Oh, this is great. I'm glad I did
this
this. This wasn't where I
really
was expecting to go, but this is
Yeah,
good.
yeah, but it's really important,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially as you kind of start to think about, like if you were going to start to map people, which I do in the book, like on the Beyonder path. Like you can't map Francis of Assisi, you can't do it because he's
Mm,
not modern. And
mm.
so the triangulation happens inside the conflicts and dilemmas of modernity.
In
So
response to modernity. Yeah.
because
Mhm.
Ned Stark's like in a fictional medieval period, he doesn't have to deal with triangulation.
Mm.
No medieval person they had to deal with their own issues, but the triangulation between the will of power and the modern moral order and exclusive humanism, like, and then those who still hold to something beyond, that was not something anyone could imagine.
He didn't live in the imminent frame, so he didn't
He didn't live
experience the
inside
same
the
pressures. Yeah. Hmm.
he
Hmm.
didn't. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, the medieval perspective takes very well both the will to power and the modern moral order are do not frame their moral imagination.
Hmm.
They have very different things forming their moral imagination. So it's not that you're weak and you're not finding your inner self to do something. The self is too porous to
That's right.
have
Yeah.
to be able to choose one of those things,
That
and
makes
then
total sense.
falsify the others. You know what I mean?
Hmm. 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 Part of me wants to double down on that and say, well, according to George R. R. Martin's presentation, where would we put George R. R. Martin based on how he's presenting these pre-modern folks? But well, we don't have time to do that. So,
Well, I mean, just to say quickly, I do
yeah,
think something in probably Martin, if you asked him like how he votes or what he feels comfortable with, right,
mm,
he would probably map himself more on the modern moral order side, right?
hmm,
But
hmm,
what he's actually, I think, scratching within himself is a little bit of an counter enlightenment side.
hmm.
I think a lot of us who have a certain sensibility of knowing we can't go back, kind of like thinking about how we might go back. Part of what's appealing about that is feeling like there's a certain way. I mean, it would be interesting in theology. I think people who have more of a counter enlightenment sense are more interested in retrieval than those who are on the other side, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Yeah, that does make total sense to me. Um, yeah. Oh man, that was fun. Thanks for hearing me on that.
Felt like we were on
Um,
a game show.
yeah, yeah, yeah. In our last couple minutes, I do want to talk about the Beyonder corner. So you map memoirs. The common threads you draw were confession and surrender. And if I'm remembering right, you map memoirs of people surrendering to things like illness in that corner. So I'd love for you to just in our last few minutes just unpack some more of
Yeah.
that and how that relates to our imagination for ministry right now.
Yeah. I think the big takeaway here, in some ways, that people could jump ahead and just get to this.
Hmm.
I think the contribution that's unique, whether it's right or it's not, is the triangle.
Hmm.
But I have to build up to it. So you get like 4 chapters of just talking about the self to get to this. And I hope those do some good work in themselves. But I think you could really see yourself wanting to get to the middle of the book. But what's so important about that is both what the counter enlightenment and the modern moral order, exclusive humanists share is they have a very high anthropology. They
Mm.
think that the self
Yeah.
can, in its actions or in its contemplations of itself, that it can save itself. There's
Hmm.
reasons it can't. There's a kind of, I try to do this, I'm addicted to the retrieval piece, like they are Rousseauian in the sense that they think what is wrong with us is nothing inherent within us. It's that society corrupts us in some ways. So society actually makes you timid, so you can't take your
Right.
will to power. I mean, that was Nietzsche's big point. Like essentially, like Victorian European 19th century guts us of our heroic mythic voyage, or it takes away your identity. So they have very high anthropologies,
Mm.
and one of the big contributions I'm trying to make with this from a kind of cultural, philosophical, and then theological perspective is to return to a more early Protestant low anthropology,
Hmm.
and that and to recognize our views of transformation are connected to our views of the self. So if we have a very high view of the self, like that the self is just so magnificent in itself, then we will be moved down the triangle to one of those sides. It will feel more coherent. It will feel to make sense. But there is this significant piece of the Christian tradition that thinks that there's a low anthropology. Not that the self doesn't matter, or that the human agent isn't important, but that the first move is to realize that there's nothing inherent within us that can save us. It's a very
Yeah.
Augustinian kind of sense that we need something outside of us to save us. So whatever transcendence there is, that transcendence has to be in breaking. It has to come to us. There's
Mm.
nothing inherent within you that can bring it forth. That there's no magical spell in any way, no form of action, no form of thinking about yourself that can be an incantation to bring that. It comes as pure gift. And it often comes when we stop, when we
Yeah.
make a confession. And one of the major examples of these kind of memoirs, and all the memoirs on the Beyonder side, I should say, like we've already referenced, these aren't like, oh, and then I found 4 interesting Christian memoirs.
Yeah.
Like these people are not like leftovers of a
Right.
time of belief or something,
Right.
they're not pastors of big churches or even bishops or something like that. Like the best example on the Beyonder side are the memoirs of addicts, like the people who
Mm.
write memoirs of their experience of being addicted. And they're just really powerful. And one of the major differences is what becomes the engine of transformation, the moment of transformation, the hinge of change isn't, wow, I found that I really was awesome,
Yeah.
or I realized I could do it. It
Hmm.
was, I realized I had to let go.
Wow.
I had to surrender. I realized that none of my actions could save me. So the other two sides really are performative. The self performs, the self
Hmm.
either does this against the world out of its own agency, or the self realizes, oh, I really am unique and wonderful. And I have all this talent that people should recognize and I should get affirmed for. Well, I mean, what's fascinating in one of the memoirs I read is that this woman who's writing it realizes that she's an alcoholic, and she's actually kind of happy she's an alcoholic. That's a little overstated, but she's a writer. And one of the things she looks at is 20th century writers that she's studying and writing a PhD dissertation on. Like one of their main tools is alcohol. Like
Mm.
alcohol supposedly helps you write, or at the very least, it gives you crazy experiences that you can then write about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So she ends up drunk, alcoholic, and then she ends up in AA. But that too has like a connection to the writer. Now you're David Foster Wallace. Now you're like you can mine the AA experience
Mm.
for all sorts of things to write on. And she gets up to do the kind of classic AA thing, which is to tell her story of the way she can't solve her own problems, and the fact she has to make a confession, if you will, that she's an alcoholic. So she starts performing. She starts performing this great story. And one of these recovering alcoholics in the back of the room yells in the midst of her telling this story, "This is boring." And it stops her in her tracks because she realizes she is performing, that
Mm.
she isn't making a confession. And in that moment, she surrenders.
Wow.
And then she knows she can't do this by herself. So she asks the great wise chain smokers of our AA programs, what do? And they tell her, you need to pray. She says, well, I don't believe any of this. So we don't give a shit. You pray. That's what you, it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. You pray. You give yourself up to
Right.
something bigger. You surrender to the possibility, even if you can't believe it now, that there may be something bigger out there that might grab you. Your own
Mm,
action as an alcoholic, the more you've tried to
that's right.
perform yourself, the more you've tried to conquer things, the more you've just screwed things up, you know?
Where's that
So
gotten you? Yeah.
um so that's probably the best example of this. But there are others, like, you know, in some sense, the sickness narrative that you overcome it is a heroic action narrative. Like you
Hmm.
never give up, like Jimmy Valvano, the basketball coach, you know, like never give up. Well, Jimmy did have to give up. He died of cancer. And that's why
Mm,
when like breath turns the air is so powerful, because
yeah.
it's a surrender. It's a surrender that I'm a finite creature and I'll die. And then
Mm,
you get this just outpouring of this beautiful gift to children being left behind.
yeah.
And there's a great memoir called The Unraveling of the Miracle by Yip Williams. It's very similar, where she has to surrender to the fact that she's dying. And it leads her into these really beautiful assertions about what a life is and what she wants to give to her daughters
Mm,
when she leaves.
wow.
So yeah, that I mean, there's something really fundamentally different about the Beyonder narratives that sees the self as in need of someone to minister to it, someone to care for
Yeah.
the self, someone to give to the self what the self doesn't have in itself. And that it starts with a kind of confession, a surrender of your own action, if you will. So a kind of surrender outside the will to power, and then it also is a confession that you're not magnificent.
Right.
I mean, you're not beautifully, deeply loved. But one of the through lines is the Bon Iver song,
I was just thinking about that. Yeah. Hmm.
where he makes his, I guess you would call it a chorus. I mean, it's the repeated line where he says, "And at once I knew I was not magnificent." And there's a kind of openness to a different kind of transformation when you can make this confession. At once I knew I was not magnificent.
Yeah.
There's a sense where I need a minister. I need someone to meet me. I need to be saved, as a gift, not as some kind of work that I perform, which I think is really important. That really holds together book 5 and book 6 in this,
Yeah.
the way that a kind of late capitalist consumer age um, gets into our views of the good life and demands that we perform, do more,
Mm,
do more. Always see yourself in a competition. Always see yourself as a little business trying to win market share.
yeah. Man, that's so helpful. I will end. I want to end by asking you what you're working on. I just want to reflect back after that. I find myself, I think it resonates with me so deeply, this path of surrender and confession, the Beyonder story. It resonates with me so deeply in a second naivete kind of way, I think, where like, I grew up in a really good conservative evangelical,
Mm.
we loved the stories of the testimonies of transformation, hitting rock bottom, finding Jesus, like all that stuff. But what I was thinking about as you were narrating that was part of the way I was told to talk about the gospel was to start with the bad news that you're a sinner and, like there's nothing you can do about it. And I always was like, okay, I guess I believe that, but that's not compelling. There's nothing there that's attractive or whatever. But I think what I'm trying to say is I think I'm almost returning to that truth in that second naivete kind of way about, but kind of translated into this language of surrender and confession, which is to say, instead of just bludgeoning people with like you're a sinner and like you're kind of that lowly worm in the dust, kind of low anthropology, more of the like what you just said, you can't actually ultimately save yourself, and the release of that is actually good news, and it's not this being bludgeoned with bad news and how low and dirty you are. It's more of a just come to an honest assessment of your actual capacity as a person.
Yeah, and I think
um
one way to sum that up really quickly is that
mhm,
there is the danger, and it can be spiritually abusive,
right.
out of this low anthropology, that the move you make, the way you try to form people, is to make a confession that they suck. Like, I
Right.
just suck. I suck. I suck. I suck. That's not where this actually theologically where this wants to go. It's rather the confession that
Yeah.
I am not the kind of creature who can save myself. I'm not the kind of creature who doesn't need others. I'm
That's
the
right.
kind of being who needs to be embraced and cared for. It's really a confession of limit, not a confession
Yes,
of being an awful creature.
that's good.
It's the sense that the more I think I can substantiate my own being the more I spin my wheels. That and it really ultimately, at its best and its most beautiful, is supposed to turn our eyes to this kind of God who comes near to us, particularly when we're in such need, particularly
Mm.
known in the cross of Christ, who comes that comes close to us in our own deepest longings. Like that, it actually is supposed to lead us to not think about ourselves as
That's
much,
right.
and to really think about who this God is who comes so near. It really is, and another way to say this is, and I try to develop this towards the end of the book, it makes the psalmist the model of the true kind of
Yeah.
memoiristic, the poet, that the psalmist who cries out in joy and in suffering, in lament and in hope. That's that's what changes
Oh.
us. The psalmist doesn't say, "I'm amazing, look what I can overcome," nor does the psalmist say, like, "Oh, I have this inner talent within me." But the psalmist also has a sense of yearning for something. And so it
Mhm.
really is not "you suck" or "you're a worm." It's that um, you're the psalmist living a
Yeah.
life, and it will lead you to cry out. And if you put the pressure on yourself that you have to be happy all the time and be satisfied all the time, and um, that it's a devastating way to live, that there's an invitation,
Yeah.
that God comes near when we can confess we're the kind of creatures who need others.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, well put. Thank you. I just had this thought of I would love to do a research project of evangelical worship songs as they relate to the triangle. There might be
Yay,
something going on there. You
that'd be a
just
great project.
your comment about the psalmist made me think of that. All right, we're over our time, so I want to respect your time. And but is there anything before we sign off? Is there anything that you want to point people to that you're working on next? Any upcoming projects? Anything like that?
No, yeah, just this one's coming out. I always got other things that I'm working on, and yeah, I mean everything kind of is really trying to think all these very practical
Yeah,
cultural realities through the theology of the cross. So what I'm working on now, and I don't know where it will land, and again, it won't be volume 7,
right.
because that won't be allowed. This kind of thinking of evangelism through the theology of the cross,
Mm,
and thinking about what that actually looks like, and
interesting.
um, we'll
Well,
see.
I'll be waiting with bated breath for when more comes out about that. We'll be definitely whatever you write, I will read. And then we'll have you on to talk. Um, but seriously, thank you for your work. Yeah, really has meant a lot. And I know that I know there are others watching who resonate with this as well. So
Well,
thanks
thanks,
for
Joel.
your time.
You're one of my favorite people to talk to about this stuff. So
Well,
thanks.
thank you.